The billionaire heir was sold into a marriage, but he risked it all to save a poor single mother with a shocking secret deal. Caspian Vance, the billionaire heir, stood at the altar, the air thick with the scent of 5,000 white lilies, a fragrance that smelled more like a funeral than a wedding. Every eye in the cathedral was fixed on him, but Caspian felt like he was looking through a telescope from another planet. He looked down at the gold-plated fountain pen in his hand. If he signed the document resting on the mahogany podium, the merger between Vance Holdings and Thorne Industries would be final. He would be legally bound to Maura Thorne, a woman who viewed him as a strategic asset rather than a husband. His father's legacy would be saved, but Caspian's soul would be the collateral damage. Before we continue the story, comment below which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The silence of the congregation was broken only by the faint whir of the cameras, broadcasting the wedding of the century to millions of screens across America. To the public, this was the pinnacle of success, two dynasties uniting to create a tech empire. To Caspian, it was the final door closing on his life. Then, he saw her. Standing near the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral was a woman who didn't belong in this world of silk and diamonds. Jo Gable was wearing a simple dark coat, her face pale under the dim light of the vestibule. She wasn't holding a bouquet or a program. She was clutching a thick manila envelope to her chest as if her life depended on it. In that moment, the grandeur of the cathedral vanished. Caspian realized that his father, Miguel Vance, hadn't just arranged a marriage, he had engineered a trap. The papers Jo held were a shocking legal assault designed to break her spirit and force Caspian into submission. For Caspian, life had always been a series of high-gloss photos and low-frequency misery. As the tech billionaire CEO of Vance Holdings, he was the face of American innovation. But the company was a hollow shell, rotting from the inside due to Miguel's old money arrogance and refusal to adapt. They were bleeding cash, and the Thorne family were the only vultures circling the carcass. Miguel Vance didn't see a company as a group of people, he saw it as a scoreboard where he was the only one allowed to keep points. To him, Caspian was a puppet whose strings were starting to fray. "You are a Vance," Miguel had hissed in the dressing room earlier, his voice like cold iron. "And a Vance does what is necessary to win, even if it means sacrificing a few feelings along the way." Caspian spent his days in a penthouse that felt more like a museum, beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. He was trapped in a schedule that dictated his every move, from the specific shade of his silk tie to the spontaneous smiles he gave to the paparazzi. He was the most powerful man in the boardroom, yet he didn't even have the authority to change his own mind. But the prison of gold had begun to crumble on a rainy Tuesday night in Manhattan, weeks before the wedding. Caspian had escaped the suffocating quiet of his home to walk the floors of the Vance Research and Development Wing. He loved the smell of ozone and the hum of the servers. It reminded him of the time before he was a CEO, when he was just a kid who loved to build things. That was when he saw the woman who would become his conscience. Jo Gable moved through the darkened office with a focused, rhythmic grace. She was a poor single mother, a midnight cleaner who saw the world Caspian only viewed through tinted glass. While Caspian was worried about market shares and stock options, Jo was worried about the rising cost of heating oil and the fact that her son, Leo, had outgrown his shoes for the third time in a year. Their first conversation hadn't been about business or legacy. It had been about a jammed coffee machine in the break room. "If you kick it on the left side, it usually listens," Jo had said, not looking up from the glass partition she was polishing. Caspian had laughed, a real gut-deep sound that startled him. "Is that the official maintenance protocol?" "No," she replied, finally looking at him. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and entirely unimpressed by his $5,000 suit. "It's the, I have 3 minutes for a break, and I'm not spending them waiting for a light to turn green protocol." In that empty office, under the flickering fluorescent lights, Caspian found something he hadn't experienced in a decade, a person who spoke the truth. Jo didn't want anything from him. She didn't even know he was the man who owned the building. For the first time, Caspian realized he was more than just a last name. As the weeks passed, their midnight meetings became the only time Caspian felt alive. He learned about the real America from Joe, the struggle of the working poor who are one flat tire or one sick day away from losing everything. He saw the fire in her when she spoke about Leo and the dreams she had for him that didn't involve boardrooms or forced mergers. But as Caspian fell in love with Joe, he began to see the Thorn merger for what it really was, a liquidation of the American worker. The Thorns didn't want to innovate. They wanted to strip the Vance plants and move the jobs overseas to maximize their own ROI. They intended to destroy the lives of 3,000 families to pad their own pockets. Caspian knew he had to fight back. He began a secret shadow war, working with Silicon Valley white knight investors to pivot the company toward renewable energy. But Miguel Vance was a master of the game. He didn't just notice Caspian's absence, he identified the distraction that was causing it. Miguel's wrath wasn't just corporate, it was personal. When Joe refused his bribe, Miguel didn't just fire her. He went deeper. He used his connections to find a ghost from Joe's past, Leo's biological father, and funded a shocking custody battle that threatened to rip Joe's world apart. Now, standing at the altar, Caspian looked at the gold pen. He looked at his father's triumphant, predatory smile in the front row. And then, he looked at Joe, standing at the back of the church with the legal papers in her hand, her eyes filled with a desperate, silent hope. The wedding of the century was about to become the biggest corporate and personal explosion in New York history. Caspian wasn't just a groom waiting to sign a contract. He was a man with a secret deal, a hidden ally in Maura Thorne, and a heart that was finally, irrevocably on fire. The blue glow of the server monitors cast long shadows across the floor as Caspian stepped closer to the break room. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man standing in the presence of someone who actually knew who they were. Joe didn't look at him with the hunger for status that he saw in Maura Thorne's eyes. She looked at him with the tired, honest exhaustion of someone who had earned every minute of her day. "You're the Vance kid, aren't you?" Joe asked, tossing her cloth into the tray of her cleaning cart. She didn't say it with awe. She said it the way someone might identify a specific model of a car, objective and unimpressed. Before we dive deeper, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. "Thank you." Caspian smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face. "I suppose I am. And you are the person who actually keeps this place running while I'm upstairs staring at spreadsheets." "I'm Joe," she said, pulling off her rubber gloves. "And if you're looking for the coffee, the machine in the break room is the only one that actually works after midnight. The executive lounge ones are just for show, apparently." As they walked toward the break room, the silence of the building began to feel less like a void and more like a sanctuary. Caspian found himself talking, really talking. He told her about the pressure of the merger, the weight of his father, expectations, and the feeling that he was a passenger in his own life. Joe listened, but she didn't offer empty platitudes. She spoke about the reality of life in the city, the cost of a gallon of milk, the stress of a child's fever when you've used up your sick days, and the quiet dignity of a clean home. She told him about Leo, her son, who was obsessed with space and wanted to be an astronaut because up there everyone looks the same size. "You know," Joe said, leaning against the laminate countertop of the break room, "my grandmother used to say that some people are so poor, all they have is money. I never really understood that until I saw you standing in the dark tonight." That comment hit Caspian harder than any boardroom critique. He realized that while he had the power to sign checks for millions, he didn't have the power to choose his own dinner, his own friends, or his own future. He was a billionaire heir, but Joe, with her 2 jobs and her small apartment, was the one who was truly free. Over the next few weeks, the midnight meetings became a ritual. Caspian began to find excuses to stay late. He would bring high-end pastries from the bakery near his penthouse, which they would eat off paper towels. In return, Joe taught him about the real America that existed outside his tinted windows. She told him about the local community centers that were losing funding, and the families who were one car breakdown away from losing everything. These conversations began to change Caspian's perspective on the company. He started looking at the Vance Holdings manufacturing plants not as assets, to be sold off in a merger, but as communities of people like Joe. He realized that the Thorn merger wasn't a rescue mission, it was a liquidation plan disguised as a partnership. The Thorns intended to close the domestic plants and move everything overseas, cutting thousands of jobs to maximize their own ROI. The intimacy between them grew, not in the way of a flashy Hollywood romance, but in the quiet, shared moments of understanding. One evening, Joe invited him to the diner where she worked her morning shift. Caspian showed up in a plain hoodie, trying his best to blend in. He sat at a corner booth and watched her. He saw her handle a difficult customer with a smile, saw her slip an extra pancake to a regular who she knew was struggling, and saw the way her face lit up when Leo ran in after school, his backpack nearly as big as he was. Seeing Joe as a single mother in her element was a revelation for Caspian. She wasn't just surviving, she was building a world of love in the middle of a concrete jungle. However, the prison of gold was never far away. Miguel Vance was starting to notice his son's frequent absences from society events. The tabloids were starting to whisper about the reclusive billionaire, and Maura Thorne was growing impatient. The merger was a month away, and the legal teams were finalizing the prenuptial agreements that would effectively turn Caspian into a Thorne employee. One night, as Caspian walked Joe to her car, a rusted sedan that groaned every time the engine turned over, he felt a surge of protectiveness he had never felt before. He looked at her, the streetlights reflecting in her eyes, and for a moment, the billion-dollar debt and the family legacy didn't matter. "Joe," he started, his voice low, "if I could walk away from all of it, from the name, the money, the company, would there be a place for me in your world?" Joe looked at him for a long time. She didn't answer right away. She knew the weight of his world, and she knew the weight of hers. "Caspian," she said softly, "my world is hard. It's early mornings and late nights and counting pennies. You don't walk into my world because you're bored. You walk into it because you're brave enough to be yourself." She kissed him then, a brief, soft pressure that tasted like coffee and honesty. It was the first time Caspian had been kissed by someone who didn't want anything from him. But as she drove away, Caspian saw a black SUV parked across the street, its headlights flickering once. His father's security team was watching. The secret was out, and Miguel Vance was not a man who allowed his investments to be ruined by a cleaning girl. The war for Caspian's soul was about to begin, and the stakes were no longer just about a company. They were about the life of a poor single mother and the man who was finally learning how to love her. The morning after the kiss in the parking lot, the atmosphere in the Vance penthouse was frigid. Miguel Vance sat at the head of the breakfast table, not eating, but meticulously reviewing a surveillance report. He didn't look up when Caspian entered. He simply slid a grainy, high-resolution photograph across the marble surface. It was a shot of Caspian and Joe at the diner, their heads close together in a moment of shared laughter. "She's a distraction, Caspian," Miguel said, his voice as sharp and cold as a razor. "And in a merger of this magnitude, distractions are liabilities. I've already contacted the agency. She's been removed from the cleaning rotation at headquarters. It's for the best." The blood in Caspian's veins turned to ice. He realized that to his father, Joe wasn't a human being with a life and a son. She was a line item to be deleted. But instead of the usual submission Miguel expected, Caspian felt a burning clarity. He realized that if he wanted to save Joe and himself, he couldn't just fight his father with emotion. He had to fight him with the only language Miguel understood: leverage. Caspian spent the next week playing the role of the perfect heir. He attended the gala dinners with Maura Thorne, nodding at the right times and discussing synergy and market share. But behind the scenes, his mind was a battlefield. He realized that the Thorne merger was actually a vulture move. They intended to strip the Vance manufacturing plants, the ones Joe had told him about, and sell the equipment to overseas competitors. It would save the Vance name, but it would destroy 10,000 American jobs. Driven by the stories Joe had shared about the families in those factory towns, Caspian began his secret search for a white knight. He spent his nights in a rented office in Brooklyn, far from the prying eyes of his father's security. He reached out to a group of Silicon Valley venture capitalists who were looking for exactly what the Vance company had: legacy infrastructure ready for a high-tech pivot. He wasn't looking for a marriage, he was looking for an investment. He pitched a plan to convert the old Vance engine plants into state-of-the-art renewable energy battery hubs. It was a renewable pivot that promised an ROI that made the Thorn merger look like a relic of the past. Meanwhile, his relationship with Joe had moved into the shadows. They met in quiet parks and late-night grocery stores. Caspian saw the toll his father's interference was taking. Joe had lost her job at the headquarters, and while she still had the diner, the loss of income was a heavy blow to a single mother living paycheck to paycheck. Yet, she refused to take a single dollar from Caspian. "If I take your money, Caspian, then your father is right about me," she said, one evening as they sat on a park bench, watching Leo play in the distance. "I'm not a line item in your budget. I'm a woman who loves you." There's a difference. The intimacy between them grew deeper under the pressure. Caspian found himself helping Leo with his science homework, explaining the physics of rockets while Joe worked her second shift. He was experiencing a life he had never known, a life where the value of an hour was measured in laughter and shared meals, not in stock dividends. He realized that Joe wasn't just a woman he loved, she was the conscience he had forgotten he had. But Miguel was not sitting idle. He saw that firing Joe hadn't broken Caspian's spirit. He realized that his son was up to something, and Miguel Vance didn't become a billionaire by being blindsided. He began to tighten the noose, moving the wedding date forward by 2 weeks and demanding that Caspian sign a power of attorney agreement that would give Miguel total control over the company's assets until the wedding was finalized. Caspian was now in a race against time. He had to finalize the White Knight deal before the wedding bells rang. He was a tech billionaire CEO playing a double game, living one life in the spotlight of the Hamptons and another in the grit of the real world. The stress was visible. He was losing weight, his eyes were shadowed, and Maura Thorne began to complain that he was mentally absent. Miguel, however, misread the signs. He thought the pressure was finally breaking Caspian into the man he wanted him to be. He didn't realize that Caspian wasn't breaking, he was transforming. One night, after a particularly grueling negotiation with the Silicon Valley group, Caspian arrived at Joe's apartment. He was exhausted, his suit jacket wrinkled, his hair a mess. Joe took one look at him and pulled him into the kitchen. She didn't ask about the company or the money. She just made him a grilled cheese sandwich and sat with him in the quiet. "You're tired of being the hero, aren't you?" she whispered, her hand resting on his. "I just want to be Caspian," he admitted. "But to be Caspian, I have to win this war. If I lose, my father wins, the Thorns win, and thousands of people lose everything. I can't let that happen." Joe looked at him with a fierce pride. "Then win," she said. "Not for the company, not for me. Win because you're the only one in that world who remembers what it's like to be human." As Caspian left her apartment that night, he knew the final confrontation was coming. Miguel had discovered the secret office in Brooklyn. The shadow war was about to explode into the light and the patriarchs. Wrath was going to be more shocking than Caspian could have ever imagined. The air in the Vance corporate offices felt colder than usual, the high-altitude glass, windows offering a view of a city that Miguel Vance believed he owned by divine right. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to eliminate the opposition so completely that they became a memory. The confrontation happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Joe was walking to her car after her shift at the diner when the black SUV she had seen weeks before pulled up, blocking her path. The window rolled down to reveal Miguel Vance. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, as if he were dealing with a minor accounting error that had gone on too long. "Get in, Miss Gable," he said. "It wasn't a request. We have things to discuss that don't belong on a sidewalk." Against her better judgment, Joe climbed into the leather-scented interior. Miguel didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened a briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $500,000 and a set of deed papers for a house in a quiet suburb 3 states away. "Caspian is a sentimental boy," Miguel said. his voice smooth and devoid of empathy. "He thinks he's in love with a struggle, but I know what you actually need. You need security for your son. You need to never have to scrub a floor again. Take this, move by Monday, and I'll ensure your son's tuition is paid for through university. All you have to do is let Caspian believe you grew tired of him." Joe looked at the check. It was more money than she would ever see in her life. She thought about Leo's future, the medical bills she struggled to pay, and the constant fear of the landlord's knock. For a split second, the temptation was a physical weight. But then she looked at Miguel, a man who lived in a palace but looked like he had never known a moment of genuine peace. "You really don't know your son at all, do you?" Joe asked, her voice steady. She pushed the envelope back toward him. "You think everything is a transaction. You think Caspian is a trophy and I'm a debt to be settled. But Caspian isn't looking for a struggle, Mr. Vance. He's looking for a home. And you can't buy that, no matter how many zeros you put on a check." Miguel's eyes darkened. The mask of boredom slipped, revealing a predatory edge. "You're making a mistake, Jolene. By Monday, Caspian will be married to Maura Thorne. If you're still in this city, I will ensure that no diner, no cleaning agency, and no school will touch you or your son. I will make you a ghost in this town." "I was already a ghost to people like you," Joe replied, opening the door. "But Caspian saw me, and because he saw me, he finally saw you too." She stepped out into the rain, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew Miguel wasn't bluffing. In the American corporate landscape, a man with Miguel's resources could easily dismantle the life of a single mother. She was terrified, but she was also certain of one thing: she would rather be a ghost with her integrity than a wealthy woman who had sold the man she loved. When Caspian found out about the meeting, he went straight to his father's study. The two men stood on opposite sides of the room, the patriarch who had built an empire on cold logic, and the heir who had found a soul. "You tried to buy her," Caspian whispered, the betrayal stinging more than the threats. "I tried to save you," Miguel countered, slamming his hand on the desk. "The banks are calling. Caspian, Thorne is the only way. If you don't sign that marriage contract on Saturday, the 3,000, families that work for us will be on the street by Monday morning. Their blood will be on your hands because you wanted to play house with a waitress." This was the ultimate ultimatum. Miguel was using Caspian's own empathy against him. He was framing Caspian's love as an act of selfishness that would destroy thousands of innocent lives. Caspian felt the walls of the golden cage closing in. He was being mocked by his own morality. Caspian didn't argue. He realized that words were useless against his father's worldview. He turned and walked out, but he didn't go to Joe. He went to his private lab. He had 48 hours left. He pulled up the encrypted files from the Silicon Valley investors. The deal was nearly done, but Miguel was about to play a card that Caspian hadn't prepared for. As Caspian worked through the night, a courier arrived at Joe's apartment. It wasn't another bribe. It was a legal summons. Miguel had found Leo's biological father and filed for an emergency custody hearing. The patriarch's wrath had moved from the boardroom to the one place that could truly break Joe, her child. The fluorescent lights of the family court hallway flickered with a cold, rhythmic buzz that felt like a countdown. Joe sat on a hard plastic chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the summons. Beside her, Caspian felt a rage he had never known. A rage that didn't come from a loss of profit, but from the realization that his father was willing to weaponize a child's life to protect a stock price. Miguel Vance hadn't just hired a lawyer for Leo's biological father, Marcus. He had hired a shark who specialized in high-stakes character assassination. Marcus had been out of the picture for years, a shadow in Joe's past that she had worked tirelessly to protect Leo from. Now, he sat across the hallway in a brand-new suit, flanked by Miguel's private security, looking like a reformed man. "This is how he wins, Caspian," Joe whispered, her voice trembling. "He doesn't have to prove Marcus is a good father. He just has to prove that I'm unstable because I'm associated with you. He's using our love to prove I'm a danger to my own son." Caspian realized the depth of the trap. If he stayed with Joe, the court would see a distracted mother involved in a high-profile scandal with a billionaire. If he left her, she would be alone against Miguel's millions. It was a shocking use of the American legal system. turning a mother's greatest love into her greatest liability. Caspian stepped away to make a phone call. He didn't call his corporate lawyers. He called a specialist he had met. During his volunteer work, a woman who knew how to fight for the underdog. "I need you at the courthouse," Caspian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "And I need you to find out exactly how much Miguel Vance paid Marcus to show up today. Follow the money trail. There's always a trail." While the legal battle intensified in the closed-door hearing, Caspian was forced to return to the Vance headquarters. The Thorne wedding was now less than 48 hours away, and Miguel was watching his every move. Caspian had to maintain the charade. He sat through a final fitting for his tuxedo, the tailor pinning the fabric while Miguel stood in the corner, sipping scotch. "The hearing is going well, I hear," Miguel said, his tone conversational. "Marcus is very convincing. It would be a shame for that boy to be raised by a man like that. But then again, if the mother was more stable, perhaps she could keep him. A stable mother wouldn't be causing a national scandal with a man who is supposed to be marrying someone else." Caspian felt the golden cage vibrating with the force of his father's malice. He realized that Miguel was waiting for him to beg. He wanted Caspian to trade the Thorne signature for Leo's safety. But Caspian had a different plan. He knew that Miguel's power came from his ability to control the narrative. So, Caspian decided to change the story entirely. He spent the night in his office, not looking at merger documents, but reviewing the Thorne family's private holdings. If he was going to be forced into a marriage of convenience, he was going to make sure he knew exactly who he was climbing into bed with. That was when he found the anomaly. Maura Thorne wasn't just a cold socialite. She was the sole signatory on a series of offshore accounts that were being used to drain Thorne Industries' pension funds. She wasn't an accomplice. She was a victim of her father's embezzlement, her name used to shield him from federal investigation. Caspian realized that Maura was just as trapped as he was. Her father was using the Vance merger to fill the hole in the pension fund before the auditors arrived. The custody trap was meant to break Joe, but it had given Caspian the final piece of the puzzle. He wasn't just fighting for a single mother anymore. He was preparing to dismantle two dynasties at once. He sent a coded message to Maura Thorne. "I know about the pension fund. Meet me at the rehearsal dinner. We're not getting married. We're getting even." As the sun began to rise on the day of the rehearsal, Caspian returned to the courthouse. Joe emerged from the hearing, her eyes red but her chin held high. The judge had granted a temporary stay, but the final decision would be made on Monday, the day after the wedding. "He thinks he has me," Caspian whispered to Joe as he held her in the parking lot. "He thinks he can use Leo to make me sign. But he forgot one thing about the American dream, Joe." "What's that?" she asked. "The people at the bottom always see the cracks in the foundation before the people at the top," Caspian said. "And tomorrow, I'm going to make the whole building come down." The rain-slicked streets of Manhattan mirrored the chaos inside Caspian, his mind as he pulled up to the exclusive club for the rehearsal dinner. The custody trap had been a brutal blow, but it had also stripped away any lingering hesitation Caspian had about destroying his father's world. He was no longer playing for profit, he was playing for lives. The rehearsal dinner was a sea of forced smiles and expensive champagne. Maura Thorne stood by the window, her white silk dress shimmering under the chandeliers, looking every bit the triumphant bride. But when her eyes met Caspian's, he saw the same flicker of terror he felt in his own chest. She wasn't a partner in this crime, she was the ultimate fall girl. Caspian leaned in close, as if whispering a romantic secret. "Your father is using your signature to drain the employee pension funds, Maura. If this merger goes through, you're not becoming a CEO, you're becoming a federal inmate." Maura's glass trembled. The mask of icy perfection shattered, revealing a woman who had been living in a nightmare of her own. "He told me it was the only way to save the family name," she hissed back, her voice barely audible over the string quartet. "He said if I didn't sign the merger, he'd let the auditors find my name on the offshore accounts. He's lying to you, just like my father is lying to me," Caspian said, his voice a steady anchor. "They don't want to save our families. They want to save themselves. But I have a white knight investor ready to move. If we combine my tech pivot with the evidence of your father's embezzlement, we don't just stop the merger. We take back both companies. In that moment, an unlikely alliance was born. The Thorne betrayal wasn't a betrayal of love, but a betrayal of the corruption that had poisoned their lives. For the next 3 hours, while their fathers toasted to their glorious union, Caspian and Maura sat in a corner, ostensibly discussing wedding details. In reality, they were cross-referencing bank statements and encrypted files. Maura provided the final smoking gun, a recording of her father admitted to the pension fraud. In exchange, Caspian promised her a seat on the new board and legal immunity. They were two heirs who had been mocked by their parents, now turning into the very monsters their fathers feared: intelligent, independent, and vengeful. While Caspian was navigating the corporate battlefield, he was also managing the custody trap. His private investigators had finally struck gold. Marcus, Leo's biological father, wasn't just being paid by Miguel, he was currently in violation of a parole agreement in another state, a fact Miguel's lawyers had conveniently buried. Caspian sent the evidence to Joe's lawyer with a simple instruction: wait for the wedding. When I give the signal at the altar, file the motion for a permanent restraining order. We're going to end this all at once. The night before the wedding, Caspian didn't sleep. He sat in his darkened office, watching the city breathe. He thought about Joe, sitting in her small apartment, holding Leo, and wondering if her world was about to end. He thought about the 3,000 workers who were oblivious to the fact that their retirement funds were being gambled away by two old men in tuxedos. Caspian realized that his father's prison of gold wasn't just built on money, it was built on the silence of the people inside it. But tomorrow, Caspian was going to find his voice. The morning of the wedding, the air was crisp and clear. The cathedral was packed with the elite of American society. Miguel Vance walked into the vestry, looking like a king ready to crown his successor. He clapped Caspian on the shoulder, his grip tightening like a vice. "Today, you become a man, Caspian," Miguel said. "Today, you save the Vance name." Caspian looked his father in the eye, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to look away. "You're right, father. Today, I'm going to do exactly what is necessary to win." As the organ began to play the opening chords of the processional, Caspian took his place at the altar. He saw Maura walking down the aisle, her veil hiding the fact that she was carrying a digital bomb in her lace-covered hand. And at the very back, he saw Joe. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and faith that nearly broke him. He gave her a single sharp nod. The shadow war was over. The altar of truth was about to begin. The merger papers were waiting on the podium. The pen was ready. The cameras were rolling. But Caspian Vance wasn't there to sign a contract. He was there to start a revolution. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Cathedral swung shut, sealing the world of the common man outside and leaving only the high society elite within the vaulted, incense-filled air. Every camera lens in the building was trained on the altar, broadcast to millions who expected a storybook union. They had no idea they were about to witness a demolition. Caspian stood perfectly still as Maura Thorne reached the altar. To the crowd, she was a breathtaking bride. To Caspian, she was his co-conspirator. As the priest began the invocation, Caspian felt the encrypted flash drive in his pocket, a digital weapon. Containing the Silicon Valley investment agreement and the evidence of the Thorne pension fraud, the ceremony moved with an agonizing slowness. Miguel Vance sat in the front row, his chest puffed out, already mentally, celebrating the influx of Thorne cash that would cover his debts. He caught Caspian's eye and gave a sharp, commanding nod. The message was clear: sign the papers or Joe loses her son. Then came the moment of the signing. The merger and marriage folder was laid out on the mahogany podium. This was the point of no return. Caspian stepped forward, but instead of picking up the gold pen, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek carbon fiber tablet. He tapped the screen, and suddenly, the massive digital displays that had been set up to show photos of the happy couple flickered and changed. Across the cathedral, the images of the Thorne and Vance legacies were replaced by a live feed of the Silicon Valley term sheet. But that wasn't all. Beside it appeared the leaked audio files Maura had provided, the recording of her father admitted to the pension theft. A collective, shocking gasp ripped through the congregation. "What is this?" Miguel roared, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at his son. "Caspian, shut that off! It's the truth, father." Caspian's voice boomed through the speakers, steady and resonant. "The truth is that this merger isn't a rescue, it's a cover-up for a crime. And the truth is that Vance Holdings doesn't need the Thorne family's stolen money. As of 60 seconds ago, our new partners in California have finalized a $500 million investment. We are pivoting to green energy. We are keeping our 3,000 workers, and we are doing it without selling our souls." The cathedral devolved into absolute chaos. Maura's father tried to flee toward the side exit, only to be met by a wall of federal agents who had been tipped off by Maura the night before. Miguel turned to Caspian, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You've ruined us. I'll make sure that girl never sees her child again. I'll spend every cent I have left to destroy her." Caspian leaned in, his face inches from his father's. "You don't have any sense left, Miguel. The board just removed you for cause based on the moral turpitude clause in your contract. And as for the custody case, the judge just received proof that you bribed Marcus. He's being arrested for perjury as we speak." Caspian didn't wait for a reply. He turned his back on the ruins of the old money world. He walked down the aisle, past the stunned socialites and the frantic reporters. When he reached the back of the church, Jo was waiting. She was shaking, the manila envelope still held tight to her chest, but for the first time her eyes weren't filled with fear. He took her hand, and they walked out into the bright New York afternoon. Behind them, the bells of St. Jude's were still ringing, but they weren't ringing for a wedding. They were ringing for a funeral, the funeral of a dynasty that had forgotten the value of a human life. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi were like 1,000 tiny explosions. But as Caspian and Jo stepped onto the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, the noise seemed to fade into a distant hum. For the first time in his 34 years, Caspian Vance breathed air that didn't belong to his father. The fallout was immediate and total. Within hours, the Vance Thorne scandal was the top story on every news cycle in the country. Maura Thorne's cooperation with the authorities granted her immunity, but her father was led away in handcuffs, his empire collapsing under the weight of the pension fraud. Miguel Vance, stripped of his title and his voting rights by a board of directors terrified of being implicated in his schemes, retreated to a private estate in Florida, a king with no kingdom and a father with no son. But the real story wasn't in the corporate towers. It was in a small wood-paneled courtroom on Monday morning. Caspian sat beside Jo as her lawyer presented the evidence of Miguel's bribery. Marcus, seeing the writing on the wall and facing a felony perjury charge, folded instantly. He admitted on the record that he had no interest in being a father. He had only wanted the $500,000 Miguel had promised him. The judge's gavel hit the wood with a finality that brought Jo to tears. Not only was the custody challenge dismissed with prejudice, but Jo was granted a permanent restraining order. Leo was safe. The custody trap had snapped shut on the man who built it. In the months that followed, Caspian didn't return to the penthouse. He sold his collection of luxury cars and used the proceeds to establish a legal defense fund for single parents facing predatory litigation. He moved into a modest brownstone 3 blocks away from Jo, and every morning he walked Leo to school before heading to the newly rebranded Vance Green Tech Hub. The transition wasn't easy. He had to work 18-hour days to prove to the 3,000 employees that he wasn't just another suit. He walked the factory floors, not as a visitor, but as a leader who knew their names. He kept his promise. No one was laid off. Instead, they were retrained to build the batteries that would power the next generation of American infrastructure. One evening, after a long shift, Caspian found Jo waiting for him in the small park where they had first sat months ago. The city skyline was glowing, the Vance logo now shining in a steady emerald green. "You did it, Caspian," she said, handing him a coffee, the cheap kind from the cart on the corner that they both now preferred. "You saved them, all of them." Caspian looked at his hands, the hands that used to only sign contracts, now calloused from time spent in the labs. He looked at Jo, the woman who had risked everything to keep her integrity, and at Leo, who was running in circles around a nearby tree. "I didn't save them, Jo," Caspian whispered. "I just stopped pretending that I was better than them. You're the one who saved me. You showed me that a golden cage is still just a cage, no matter how much it's worth. What do you think? Do you believe Caspian did right by not signing the Thorne-Vance merger and marriage agreement? Share your opinion in the comments and rate the story from 0 to 10. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories, and don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen.